The woman threw open the door of the Bar R ranch house before anyone could stop her. She didn't knock. She didn't wait. Dorothea Crane, wife of the bank's regional director, stepped inside like she owned every nail and floorboard, her dress pressed and her chin lifted, and she looked at the kitchen table where Mabel Whitmore was sitting, just sitting there with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup. And Dorothea's expression curdled into something that wasn't quite disgust, but wasn't far from it either. "You're still here," Dorothea said. "Not a question. A verdict." Mabel set down her cup. "Mr. Rusk's hired help doesn't receive visitors," Dorothea continued, pulling off one glove finger at a time, slow and deliberate, the way a person does when they want you to watch them do it. "Then I suppose that word hired is doing quite a lot of work in your case, isn't it?" She smiled then. That was the part that stayed with people afterward, the ones who heard about it later. Not the words, the smile. If you've ever been in a room where someone decided you didn't matter, before you opened your mouth, you already know what came next. This is the story of Mabel Whitmore, a woman who arrived at the end of the earth with $11, a heavy trunk, and a face that made strangers look away. A woman who was told in 100 different ways that she had no place here, and what she did about it anyway. Before we go any further, if stories like this one speak to something real in you, subscribe to this channel and follow Mabel's story all the way to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this woman's story has traveled. You might be surprised who else out there needed to hear it. Now let's go back to where it started. The stagecoach from Cheyenne reached the junction town of Harrow Flats, Wyoming, on a Wednesday afternoon in late October of 1884, and it deposited Mabel Whitmore on the packed dirt of the main street, along with 4 other passengers, 2 canvas mail sacks, and a crate of iron parts addressed to a man who had apparently been dead for 6 months. Mabel stood there for a moment and looked at the town. She was 34 years old, and she was not a small woman. She had wide shoulders, a thick middle, and hands that were rough at the knuckles, from years of work that had left no money behind it. She wore a brown wool coat that had been let out twice at the seams, and her hair was pinned up with the kind of pins that had gone slightly gray from use. The trunk at her feet weighed somewhere close to 60 pounds, and she had hauled it up and down 3 different train platforms and in and out of 2 stagecoaches without asking anyone for help, because she had learned early that asking for help from strangers was a way of handing them something they could use against you. She had a letter in her coat pocket. She had been carrying it for 6 weeks. The letter was from a man named Porter Gibbs, proprietor of the Harrow Flats Hotel and Dining Establishment, who had written to a placement agency in Cleveland, Ohio, stating that he needed a woman of good character and practical ability to serve as head cook and housekeeper, and that he was prepared to offer room, board, and $9 per month in wages. The agency had matched her to the position. She had written to Mr. Gibbs. Mr. Gibbs had written back. She had sold the last of what she owned that wasn't in the trunk, bought a train ticket, and come. 2,000 miles. 6 weeks of travel. She walked toward the hotel. The building was a foundation and 4 scorched walls. The roof was gone. The windows were holes. A hand-painted sign, miraculously intact, still hung from a single nail over what had been the front entrance. Gibbs Hotel Cleanrooms Good Meals. Mabel stood in front of it for a long time. A man came out of the hardware store across the street and stopped when he saw her looking at the ruin. "Fire," he said helpfully. "Back in July, old Gibbs moved his family to Denver. Whole thing's a loss." "I see," Mabel said. "You looking for lodging?" "I was looking for employment." The man looked at her, the coat, the trunk, the expression on her face that was working very hard at staying level, and he seemed to briefly consider saying something kind. Then he didn't. "Mrs. Halverson takes in boarders," he said. $2 a week. He went back inside. Mabel did the arithmetic in her head. She had $11.40. At $2 a week, she had roughly 5 weeks before she had nothing. She knew no one in this town. She had no letters of introduction, beyond the one to a man who no longer existed in this place. The nearest city was 60 miles east, and the stagecoach didn't run again until Friday. She picked up her trunk and started walking. She found the Bar R Ranch by accident, which was more or less how most things in her life had found her. She had been told by Mrs. Halverson, who had taken her $2, shown her a room the size of a closet, and delivered a look that said she was doing Mabel a considerable favor, that there was a ranch some 4 miles south of town that had recently lost its cook. The woman who told her this was not trying to help her. She was trying to explain why she'd had to order her biscuits from the general store that week. But it was information, and Mabel had always been good at taking information from people who weren't offering it intentionally. She walked the 4 miles on the following morning. The road was deeply rutted, and her boots were not designed for this terrain, and by the time the Bar R came into view, she had a blister forming on her left heel and a small but persistent ache in her lower back that she chose to ignore. The ranch was not impressive. The main house needed paint. The fence along the east pasture had sections that were being held together by wire and stubbornness. There was a barn that was structurally sound, but clearly hadn't been mucked out properly in some weeks. She saw all of this before she got to the gate. She knocked at the door of the main house. Child answered. A girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with dark hair and a serious expression and a smudge of something on her chin that might have been jam or might have been dirt. She looked at Mabel the way children sometimes do when they haven't yet learned to hide their assessments. Your father home? Mabel asked. He's in the barn, the girl said. Would you take me to him? The girl considered this. Then she stepped outside and started walking toward the barn without a word, apparently having decided that was acceptable. The man in the barn was Caleb Rusk. He was somewhere in his early 40s, lean in the way that came from not eating enough rather than from any particular discipline. And he was working on a piece of harness that had split at a junction and was fighting him about being repaired. He had the look of a man who had been fighting things that were fighting back for a while now. He looked up when they came in, and his expression went through several rapid calculations. Mr. Rusk, Mabel said, my name is Mabel Whitmore. I'm told you're in need of a cook. I was, he said. That was 2 months ago. I can't afford one now. I heard the position was still open. Whoever told you that was working with old information? He turned back to the harness. I'm sorry you made the walk out here. I also heard your books are behind, and your stores are poorly managed, and you haven't had a square meal prepared in this house in going on 6 weeks. Stopped working on the harness. I'm not asking for the $9 a month, Mabel said. I understand you don't have it. I'm asking for room and board and a chance to demonstrate what I can do. If I haven't improved your situation in a month, I'll leave without argument. He turned and looked at her fully then. Not the quick assessment he'd done when she came in, the one that had taken in her size and her coat and drawn its conclusions. This was a different kind of looking. You walked 4 miles to ask me for a job I just told you I couldn't offer, he said. I walked 4 miles to make you a proposal, she said. That's different. The girl Winnie, Mabel would learn her name, was standing slightly behind Mabel in the barn doorway, watching her father's face. Caleb Rusk set down the harness piece. The room is small, he said. I've been sleeping in a closet in town, Mabel said. I expect I'll manage. The first week nearly ended her. She had not misrepresented her skills. She could cook, she could keep accounts, she could manage a household. But managing a household that had been without a woman for a year and a half, Caleb's wife had died in the spring of 1883 of a fever that came on fast and ended faster. And Winnie had been 7, and Caleb had been a man hollowed out from the middle that was a different category of problem. Kitchen was nearly unusable. The stove had a crack in the firebox that made it burn unevenly. The stores were a mess of unlabeled sacks and half-empty tins, some of which had gone over. The root cellar had water in it from a drainage problem that nobody had addressed. She found a barrel of flour that had been sitting in proximity to a barrel of salt for long enough that something had gotten damp and then dried wrong, and the whole thing needed to be sorted by hand. She worked from before light until after dark for 6 days straight. On the 7th day, one of the ranch hands, a man named Dearborn, who was in his 50s and had the specific kind of contempt that men his age sometimes developed for women who did things they didn't expect, walked through her kitchen while she was reorganizing the stores and picked up one of the tin cups she'd moved and put it back where she'd moved it from. We keep things where they are, he said. Mabel looked at where he'd put it. It was directly in front of the window, which meant steam from the stove collected in it, which was why there was a gray mineral residue inside it from sitting damp and drying too many times. All right, she said, and put it back where she'd had it. He moved it again. She didn't react. She waited until he left the kitchen and then moved it back. She understood what this was. She'd encountered this before in other houses, with other men who needed offastish that her being useful did not mean she had standing. Cup didn't matter. The cup was a test, and the way to pass a test like that wasn't to fight it. It was to outlast it. She put a damp cloth over the cup from then on so the residue wouldn't build up, and she moved on. The real trouble arrived on a Thursday, 11 days after she came. Caleb came to her in the kitchen after supper, when Winnie was in bed and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and he sat down at the table with the expression of a man preparing to deliver bad news he'd been carrying for a while. "I should have told you this before you came out here," he said. "The bank's got a lien on this property. I've got until the end of March to bring the mortgage current, or they foreclose at Mabel wiped down the stovetop and said nothing. "The amount I'm behind is $340, he said. "I've got cattle I can sell in the spring, but the spring market won't come in time if they move the deadline. And there's a man at the bank, Crane, his name is, who's been pushing to move the deadline. I don't know why. Could be he just wants the land. Could be he has a buyer lined up. How much time do you have?" "On the original terms, until the last day of March. On whatever Crane decides, maybe less." Mabel turned around. "Why are you telling me this?" He looked slightly ashamed. "'Cause you should know what you've walked into. If this place folds in February, you'll be out in the cold with nothing to show for the work you've done." Pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "Mr. Rusk," she said, "I had $11 when I got off that stagecoach. I've been in Wyoming for 11 days, and I've already found 3 places where money is leaking out of this operation that nobody noticed. Your feed contract is overpriced. Your agreement with the general store in town has you paying 8% above what a signed account would cost you. And the drainage problem in your root cellar has been costing you in spoiled stores every month since at least last fall, from the look of the wall." Stared at her. "I'm telling you this," she said, "because you should know what you've gotten." There was a long pause. "The drainage," he said finally. "I didn't know it was that bad. It's that bad." He was quiet for a moment. "Can it be fixed? With about 4 hours of labor and some gravel?" "Yes." He looked at her across the table with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something between relief and the particular discomfort of a man who realizes he's been carrying more than he knew, and someone has just shown him how much. "I'll get the gravel," he said. By the end of the first month, 3 things had happened. The drainage in the root cellar was fixed. The feed contract had been renegotiated with a supplier 2 towns over, saving $11 a month. And the general store account had been restructured, which required Mabel to go into town herself and speak with the proprietor, a man named Featherstone, who had clearly not expected to be negotiated with by a woman, and had responded by being condescending for approximately 20 minutes before realizing she knew the accounts better than he did. None of this was glamorous. None of it showed. From the outside, the Bar R Ranch looked the same, as it always had: a struggling operation on marginal land with a mortgage problem, and too many things needing attention at once. But inside the numbers, something had shifted. Mabel kept a small ledger. She had started it in the second week, because she had always found that the best way to make an argument was with numbers rather than words, and she expected she would need to make arguments eventually. Winnie found her writing in it one evening after supper. "What is that?" Winnie asked. "Accounts," Mabel said. "What's an account?" "It's a record of what comes in and what goes out. Money, stores, time. Anything that has a value." Winnie climbed up onto the chair beside her she had taken to doing this, appearing at Mabel's elbow with the quiet consistency of a small shadow, and looked at the page. "There's a column with nothing in it," Winnie said. "That's the wages column," Mabel said. "Why is it empty?" Mabel considered how to answer this honestly. "Because your father doesn't have the money to fill it yet." Winnie looked at the empty column for a moment. Then she said, "You should still write them down. What they would be." Mabel looked at her. "So they don't get forgotten," Winnie said. She was 8 years old. She had her mother's death in her. Carried in the careful way, she watched the people around her, making sure nobody disappeared before she noticed. "All right," Mabel said, and wrote in the numbers. December arrived cold and fast. The ranch hands had settled into an uneasy tolerance of Mabel. Dearborn still moved things she'd arranged occasionally, but with less frequency and less conviction. A younger hand named Pruitt had begun leaving his coffee cup on the kitchen windowsill in the mornings as a kind of wordless request, and she left it filled because it cost her nothing. A third man, Gus, was older than Dearborn and spoke maybe 30 words a day total, had once come back to the kitchen after supper with a split piece of kindling and left it on the pile without explanation, which she understood to be an apology for something he'd said 3 days earlier that he'd decided on reflection wasn't fair. That was how it worked with men like these. Not apologies out loud. Gestures, adjustments. She had learned to read them. What she hadn't learned to read was Caleb Rusk. He was courteous, grateful, in the quiet way of a man who wasn't comfortable expressing it directly. He asked her opinion on practical matters and took it seriously, which was not something she'd experienced much. He didn't treat her as invisible, the way some men did with hired women, and he didn't treat her as a problem to be managed, the way others did. He treated her as she wasn't sure what word fit. Present, maybe. A person who was actually there. But there was something behind his eyes that stayed closed. And she understood enough about grief to know you didn't push at closed doors. The trouble was that she was starting to care whether those doors ever opened. She didn't have the luxury of that. She knew that. She was a woman without wages, in a house that wasn't hers, on a ranch that might not survive the winter, and whatever she felt was a complication she couldn't afford. Pushed it down and went back to the accounts. The afternoon that Dorothea Crane arrived was a Friday in the first week of December. Mabel's had seen her in town twice. Dorothea was the wife of the bank director, and she dressed the way women dress when they want you to understand at a glance exactly how much more they have than you. She was not an unkind woman in all situations. Mabel had watched her in the general store and seen her be perfectly pleasant with the store owner's wife. But she had a gift for a particular kind of cruelty that only activated in certain conditions, and Mabel apparently activated it. The door opened without a knock. Dorothea came in, took off her gloves one finger at a time, looked at Mabel at the kitchen table, and said, "You're still here." Mabel said nothing. "I want you to understand something," Dorothea said, moving to the center of the kitchen with the ease of a woman who believed all rooms were hers to occupy. "The arrangement you have here, whatever Mr. Rusk has allowed out of pity or poor judgment, it isn't appropriate. I've heard about you in town. A woman living on a man's property, no wages, no official position. No," she paused. "Family, I work here," Mabel said, "without pay." Dorothea let that land. "Which means you're living on Mr. Rusk's charity. And that is a particular kind of story, isn't it?" In a small town, Mabel understood what she was doing. She was telling her that talk was already circulating, that whatever slim respectability Mabel had arrived with was being spent down, and Dorothea had come to accelerate that spending. "I appreciate your concern," Mabel said, and her voice was extremely level. "My concern," Dorothea said, smiling, "is for Mr. Rusk. He's a man in a difficult situation, and attaching himself to a woman who arrived in this county with no connections and nothing to recommend her, not even a presentable appearance, I'm sorry to say, can only make that situation worse. Mr. Crane has influence at the bank, and the way Mr. Crane sees a situation is affected by the people connected to it." There it was. Clean and direct, wrapped in courtesy, but there it was. "Let Crane move the deadline, or I'll make sure he does." Mabel stood up from the table. She was taller than Dorothea by 2 inches, and wider by considerably more, and she was aware that in this moment her size, which had been a liability everywhere else, was at minimum not a disadvantage. "Mrs. Crane," she said quietly, "I think you should go now." Dorothea's smile didn't waver. "I'm simply being honest with you. Woman to woman." "I understand what you're being," Mabel said, "and I'm asking you to leave." Dorothea put her gloves back on. Slowly. "Think about what I've said," she said. For Mr. Rusk's sake, she left. Mabel stood in the kitchen for a long moment after the door closed. Then she sat back down, picked up her coffee cup, and found that her hands were not entirely steady. Put the cup down. She sat with what had just happened, the calculation of it, the precision of it, the way it had been designed to find exactly the thing she was most uncertain about and push on it until it gave. For Mr. Rusk's sake. Because if she stayed, the bank might move on the mortgage. And if the bank moved on the mortgage, it wouldn't be her land that was lost. It would be his. She sat there for a long time. Winnie came in from outside with snow on her boots and a question about supper, and Mabel answered it, and she got up and started on the meal, and she didn't let anything show on her face. Calculation had started, and she already knew, somewhere she didn't want to look at yet, that it wasn't going to end the way she wanted it to. That night, after Winnie was in bed and the hands had gone out and Caleb was in the front room with the account books, a ritual she'd begun to recognize, the way he sat with them late, as if staring at numbers long enough might change what they said. She stood in the doorway and told him about Dorothea's visit, told him plainly and without decoration. She told him what was said and what was implied and what she understood it to mean. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a silence. "I'll speak to Crane," he said. "I don't think that will help," she said. "This is my property. The decisions made about it are mine. The decision about whether to move the mortgage deadline belongs to the bank," she said. "And if Mr. Crane has made up his mind, your talking to him may make it worse. Men like that don't respond well to being challenged directly." He looked at her. "What do you think I should do?" She hadn't expected him to ask that. Not the way he asked it genuinely without defensiveness. The way you ask someone whose judgment you actually trust. I think, she said carefully, you should do whatever is best for this property and for Winnie. I think you should set aside what's best for me, because I'm new here, and this is your life and your daughter's life, not mine. He was quiet. That's not an answer, he said. No, she agreed. It isn't. She went to bed. She didn't sleep for a long time. Outside, the first real snow of winter had started to fall, coming down in the dark over the Barra Ranch and covering everything equally, the good ground and the bad, the fixed fence and the broken one, the house and the barn and the 4 miles of road that led back to town, and the $11 she no longer had, spent down now to nothing. She lay in the small room that wasn't hers and looked at the ceiling and thought about the empty column in the ledger, all those wages that had never been written in, and what Winnie had said, so they don't get forgotten. She was still thinking about that when she finally fell asleep. The snow that had started falling that night didn't stop for 3 days. By the time it let up, there were 14 inches on the flat ground and more in the drifts against the north fence, and the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that got into wood and cracked it, got into joints and made them ache, got into a person's thinking and made everything feel slightly more impossible than it had the day before. Mabel woke on the 4th morning to find the water in the kitchen basin had a skim of ice on it, and the stove had gone out sometime in the night because the wood she'd stacked beside it had been slightly too green and hadn't held. She rebuilt the fire before anyone else was up. That was the kind of thing she'd started doing without deciding to the things that needed doing before the day officially started, the invisible work that kept everything else possible. She had the stove going and the coffee on by the time Caleb came through the kitchen doorway with his coat still unbuttoned, and he stopped when he saw her because he'd clearly expected to walk into a cold room and instead walked into a warm one. You were up early, he said. Stove went out, she said. Green wood. He looked at the stove, then at her. I should have checked the stack before winter. There's dry wood in the lean-to off the east side of the barn. Enough to get through the worst of it if we're careful. He poured himself coffee and stood there for a moment, and she could see him absorbing this information and filing it away the way he did not with gratitude exactly, more with a kind of recalibration, like a man constantly adjusting to a situation that kept being slightly different than he'd prepared for. Dearborn's not going to like having to haul from the lean-to, he said. It's an extra 100 yards. Dearborn doesn't like most things, Mabel said. Something moved at the corner of Caleb's mouth. It wasn't quite a smile, more like the ghost of one passing through. No, he said. He doesn't. That was as close as either of them came to acknowledging the previous night's conversation. He drank his coffee. She started on the morning meal. Outside, the snow sat heavy and still on everything, and the ranch moved into its winter routine with the slow grinding persistence of a machine that had forgotten what it was originally built to do, but kept running anyway. She found the second money leak on a Tuesday. She'd been going through the old account books, the ones from before she came, which Caleb had stacked in the corner of the front room in the approximate order of a man who had been keeping records under duress. They were not well organized. They were full of crossed-out numbers and notations in 2 different handwritings, which told her that at some point Caleb's wife had kept the books, and then at some point she hadn't. There was a gap of about 4 months in the middle of 1,883 after the wife died, before Caleb had managed to pick it back up that was just blank pages, and Mabel ran her finger along the edge of those empty pages and understood something about what that gap had cost him that had nothing to do with money. The leak was in the supply agreement with a freighter named Aldous Peck, who ran a wagon route from the rail depot to the ranches south of Harrow Flats. Caleb was paying Peck to deliver supplies monthly, and the rate he was paying was a rate that had been set in 1,880 when Peck had 2 competitors. Both competitors had since gone out of business, and Peck had never renegotiated. He'd simply started charging more on individual items, burying the increase in the line items rather than the delivery fee, so it didn't look like what it was. Over 3 years, it had added up to somewhere between $40 and $60 above what the same goods would cost through a direct account with the depot. $40 to $60. That was real money. That was the difference, potentially, between making a payment on the mortgage and not. She brought it to Caleb that evening, with the books open on the table. He looked at the numbers for a long time. Peck's been running this route for 15 years, he said. Father ran it before him. I understand that, Mabel said. He and my father had an agreement. Your father's agreement has been costing you money for 3 years. Caleb closed the book and sat back, She could see him working through the discomfort of it, the specific discomfort of a man who valued loyalty and had been taught that loyalty ran in two directions, and was now being shown that it hadn't, in this case, run back his way. "I'll need to talk to him," he said. "Before you do," Mabel said, "you should know what a direct depot account would cost." "I wrote to them last week," he looked up. "I wrote as the household manager," she said carefully. "I asked about their rates for a ranch account at this distance. They wrote back." She produced a folded letter from the ledger. "It's cheaper, significantly. And if you sign a yearly contract, they'll deliver." He took the letter and read it. "You did this last week," he said. "I thought it was worth knowing before making any decisions." He set the letter down. He looked at her, and it was that particular look, again the one she still couldn't entirely read, that had something in it she wasn't sure she was interpreting correctly, that she'd been trying not to think about, because it was the kind of thing that could get her into trouble. "Mabel," he said. She waited. "I don't know what I would have done this winter without you here." Picked up the account book and straightened the pages. "You would have managed," she said. "You'd have figured out the supply agreement eventually." "Maybe," he said, "but eventually is a long time." She put the book back in its stack and found a reason to go check on something in the kitchen. The conversation with Aldous Peck did not go smoothly. She knew it wouldn't, because Caleb came back from it with the tight expression of a man who had said necessary things to someone who hadn't received them well, and he put his coat on the hook and sat down at the table and didn't speak for a moment. "He's switching the route," Caleb said. "He says, if I'm going to the depot directly, he'll drop this section of the run. Does that affect the Hendersons? Or the Bowman place? Henderson runs his own wagon. Bowman's already on a depot account." He paused. "Peck was mostly just running for us this end." "It doesn't hurt anyone but Peck," she said. "Peck was taking money that wasn't his to take." Caleb was quiet. "He called you something," she said. "Not a question." The expression on his face answered before he did. "He suggested that I was letting a woman make my business decisions." Were those his words? They were not, Caleb said, and his voice had gone flat in a way she hadn't heard before. She absorbed this. "It doesn't matter what he called me," she said. "It matters to me." She looked at him then, and he was looking back at her, and there was something in his face that was not ambiguous at all, not in the way the other looks had been, and it landed somewhere in her chest with a weight she wasn't prepared for. "You shouldn't let it," she said. "You have a mortgage to think about." He looked away. "Yes," he said. "I do." Winnie had started bringing her things. It began with a small stone she'd found in the creek bed, dark gray, with a white stripe through it. She left it on Mabel's windowsill without comment. Then a piece of ribbon she'd been given at some point and had apparently decided Mabel should have. Then a drawing she'd done with a stub of pencil, slightly crooked and impossible to identify as any particular subject, which she folded carefully and slid under the door. Mabel kept all of them. Kept them in the top of her trunk, which she'd mostly unpacked by now, her things arranged in the small room, with the careful order of a woman who'd learned to make a home out of whatever space she was given, and not assume it would stay hers. The stone and the ribbon and the drawing went in the top because she wanted to be able to see them when she opened the lid. Winnie didn't talk much about her mother directly. She circled the subject in the way children do. When a loss is too large to approach from the front, she'd mention things her mother had liked, or places her mother had taken her, or things her mother had said, dropped into conversation sideways, like she was testing whether it was safe. Mabel always responded the same way, simply, without making it a bigger moment than Winnie had made it, without flinching. One evening in late December, Winnie sat across from her at the kitchen table while Mabel was working on the mending she'd taken on the mending as a matter of necessity, because two of the hands had jackets that were becoming structural hazards, and said, out of nowhere, "Did you ever have children?" Mabel kept her eyes on the seam she was working. "No," she said. "You want to?" She considered the honest answer and the easy answer and chose the honest one. "I thought about it when I was younger. It didn't happen the way I expected." "Were you married?" "For a short time." Winnie absorbed this. "What happened?" "He left," Mabel said. She said it the way you say a fact about weather, just a thing that had happened, that had its own kind of truth, but didn't require embellishment. "Some sad," Winnie said. "It was," Mabel said. "It's less sad now." Winnie watched her sew for a while. "Then my father doesn't talk about my mother to anyone, except sometimes at night when he thinks I'm asleep. I can hear him. He doesn't say much. Just her name sometimes." Mabel stopped sewing. "Eleanor," Winnie said. That was her name. She said it with the particular care of a child, Protecting something precious, turning it over so gently. That's a beautiful name, Mabel said. Winnie nodded. She picked up one of the socks from the mending pile and looked at the hole in the heel with the focused seriousness she applied to most things. He likes you, she said, still looking at the sock. Mabel started sewing again. I work for your father, she said. You work for him for free, Winnie said. That's not the same thing. She put the sock down and went to bed, leaving Mabel alone with the mending and the lamp and the quiet that settled into the kitchen after the child had gone, which was a different kind of quiet than the quiet before. January was brutal. Not in any dramatic way. There was no single catastrophe, no fire or flood or blizzard that announced itself as a crisis. It was brutal in the slow, grinding way of a month that simply doesn't relent. The cold stayed below zero for 11 days in a row. 2 of the cattle in the south pasture went down sick, and 1 didn't make it. The pump froze twice and had to be thawed by hand with buckets of warm water hauled from the stove, which was Mabel's job both times, because she was up first and she understood why it mattered. Pruitt cut his hand badly enough on a piece of wire fence that she had to clean it and close it herself, using the needle and thread she'd used on the mending, and he sat on the kitchen stool and looked at the ceiling while she worked and tried not to make any sound. You do this before? He asked when it was done. My husband worked in a rail yard, she said. Before he looked at his hand. The stitches were not pretty, but they were even, and they would hold. Does it hurt less if you don't watch? Depends on the person, she said. You didn't watch. No, he said, I didn't. He left the kitchen without saying thank you, which she understood was his version of being moved. He left his cup on the windowsill twice the next morning, once before breakfast, and once after, which was, for Pruitt, practically a speech. Dearborn watched all of this from a middle distance. He'd stopped moving her things. He hadn't apologized for doing it, but he'd stopped, and she understood that the ceasing was the apology. He was a man who'd spent 30 years forming opinions quickly and was not accustomed to being wrong, and being wrong about her had cost him something he was in the process of quietly paying back. She didn't push it. You didn't push men like Dearborn. You let them find their way to where they were going at their own pace. Because if you pushed, they dug in, and then everybody lost time they didn't have. The letter from the bank arrived on the 17th of January. Caleb brought it inside and stood in the kitchen with it in his hand, without opening it for a moment. She could see from across the room that his hand was not entirely steady. He opened it. He read it. He set it on the table. She didn't ask. She waited. They've moved the deadline, he said. February 28th. That was 6 weeks away. Less by the time the letter had traveled. Crane, she said. The letter is from the bank. But yes. He sat down. The amount outstanding is $312 now. With the late fees, $312. She ran through the calculations she'd been keeping in her head, the savings from the feed contract, the depot account, the tightened stores. Over the 2 months she'd been here, they'd recovered somewhere around $60, maybe $65 in operational savings, which meant if Caleb's sold everything he could liquidate without damaging the ranch's ability to function, he was still probably $150 short minimum. What can you sell? She asked. He'd clearly already been thinking about this. 3 head of beef I was going to keep for breeding. Spare wagon. The old iron equipment in the back of the barn that was my father's and never got used. It's not worth much, but it's something. How much do you think that gets you? Maybe $90 if I'm lucky, still short. She did the arithmetic again. Still short by $60, $70 at least. Is there anyone you can borrow from? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. My brother in Kansas might have it, but he's got his own situation. And I'd have to get a letter there and back and have the money wired in time, and the timing's tight. Then write today, she said. Right now. Don't wait. He looked at her. Every day you wait is a day you don't have, she said. He got up. He got the pen and paper from the front room. He came back and sat at the kitchen table and wrote the letter, and she stayed in the kitchen and worked while he wrote, because she understood that he needed someone in the room, and he needed them to be quiet about it. When he finished, he folded it and addressed it and didn't say anything for a moment. $312, he said mostly to himself. We'll find it, she said. He looked at her with something like pain in his expression. I hate that I'm asking you to care about this. It's not your land. No, she said, it's not. But you're going to help me anyway. She picked up the account book. I'm going to help Winnie, she said, which amounts to the same thing. He was quiet after that, but she could feel something shift, slightly. In the room a kind of settling, like a wall that had been under pressure, finally finding a way to hold. The next 2 weeks were the kind of work that doesn't make for good storytelling because it is not dramatic. It is just hard. She went through every remaining contract, every standing agreement, every informal arrangement Caleb had with anyone in the county, looking for any additional leakage. She found a small one in the agreement with the blacksmith they were paying for a quarterly maintenance visit that had been reduced to twice a year by mutual convenience, but never renegotiated in price, and she found a larger one in the way the ranch had been storing grain, which was causing waste at the bottom of the storage bin, that nobody had noticed because nobody had measured how much came out versus how much went in. She measured it. The difference was roughly $3 a month. Over 2 years before she arrived. She wrote the number down and let it sit there in the ledger without commenting on it, because she understood that some numbers you write down and you look at and you don't say anything, because there's nothing to say that the number doesn't already say better. Gus, the hand who didn't talk much, came to her one morning in the second week of January with a look that meant he had something to say and was deciding how to say it. She waited. "There's a man in town," Gus said finally. "Buys scrap iron and old equipment. Better prices than the auction. He came through last fall. I don't know if he's still around." She looked at him. "You know where to find him. He stays at the Halverson place when he's in Harrow Flats." "Mrs. Halverson's boarding house?" "Yeah." She thought about the $2 a week she'd spent at Mrs. Halverson's boarding house and the closet room and the look the woman had given her, and she considered whether she was prepared to go back there. "Would you go inquire for me?" she asked. Gus looked slightly surprised. People didn't usually ask him things like this. Ask rather than tell. He considered it. "Yeah," he said, "I can do that." He came back the next afternoon with a name and a number. Scrap buyer was still in town, and his prices were better than the auction, by about 20%. When Caleb sold the old iron equipment from the barn, he got $14 for it, instead of the $9 the auction would have given him. She wrote the difference in the ledger. She wrote Gus's name next to it in small letters, not in the account section. Just in the margin, because she believed in keeping track of who had done what. The letter from Caleb's brother arrived on the 31st of January. Mabel was in the kitchen when Caleb read it. She was facing the stove, and she heard the quality of the silence behind her change, and she knew before he said anything. "He can send $100, Caleb said, "but not until mid-March, after the deadline." She kept her back to him for a moment, doing the calculations one more time, even though she already knew the answer. They were still short. The sales, the cattle, the wagon, the iron plus the saved money, plus the 100 that was coming too late, it still didn't close the gap in time. Turned around. Caleb was sitting at the table with the letter in his hand, and his face had gone to the place it went when he stopped trying to manage his expression. He looked exhausted in a way that went past physical, the exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just realized the weight isn't going to reduce. "What else can we do?" he said. She sat down across from him. She had been thinking about this for 2 days, since she'd understood the letter from his brother wasn't going to solve the problem, even if it came. There was something she hadn't said yet because she'd been calculating whether to say it, and she'd finally done enough calculating to have an answer. "I may be able to help," she said directly. He looked at her. "I know a woman in Cheyenne," she said, "a Mrs. Tolliver. We worked together years ago. She married while her husband has a stake in a supply company. She and I have been corresponding since I came west. I wrote her about the ranch, not about the details of your situation, but she knows I'm here. She's asked, in her last 2 letters, if there's anything she can do." Caleb was very still. "I haven't asked her," Mabel said. "I'm telling you about it now because I wanted your permission before I did." "You want to borrow money from me," he said. "From your friend. I want to ask if she's in a position to loan the ranch what it needs, at terms that are fair to her, with a formal agreement and a repayment schedule. It's not charity and it's not a favor. It's a business arrangement. It's you using your relationships to save my land," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." He sat with this. She could see that it cost him something, the pride of it, the specific pride of a man who had been taught that asking for help was close to admitting failure, and who had been failing quietly for long enough that the lesson had gone deep. "Why?" he said finally. She looked at him. "Because it would be a waste," she said. "All of this." She gestured at the kitchen, at the accounts, at the window beyond which lay the frozen pastures and the barn and the fence lines she'd helped him plan to repair come spring. "It would be a waste to let it go because of a man at a bank who decided to make your deadline inconvenient." He was quiet for a long moment. "And Winnie," he said. "Yes," she said. "And Winnie," he put the letter down. He looked at the table. He looked at the letter. He looked at her. Write to her, he said. She wrote the letter that night after the house was asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low and the cold pressing at the windows. She wrote it carefully because Mrs. Tolliver was a practical woman who responded well to clear information and poorly to sentimentality. And she wanted to be clear. She laid out the situation, the amount needed, the timeline, and what she believed the ranch was capable of in terms of repayment. She wrote it as an investment proposal, not a plea, because a plea would not have worked, and she knew the difference. She sealed it and left it on the table for Caleb to see in the morning. Then she sat for a moment longer, in the quiet kitchen with the dark outside, and she let herself feel, briefly and privately, the size of what she'd just done. She'd put Mrs. Tolliver's goodwill on the line. She'd put her own name behind Caleb Rusk's financial situation. She'd made herself accountable for something she had no legal standing to be accountable for, because she had no wages and no contract and no paper that said she was anything more than a woman living on a man's property and keeping his house. She'd done it anyway. She thought about Dorothea Crane's smile, for Mr. Rusk's sake, as if caring about this place was weakness, or evidence of poor judgment, or something to be used as a lever. Let her use it, Mabel thought. Let her use all of it. She turned down the lamp and went to bed. Response from Mrs. Tolliver arrived in 12 days, which was faster than Mabel had dared hope. She read it in the front room while Caleb was still outside. She read it twice. Then she folded it back up and held it for a moment with both hands, and she was surprised to find that her eyes had done something involuntary that she quickly corrected before anyone could see. Caleb came in from the cold with snow on his hat and stopped when he saw her expression. Good news or bad, he said. She'll do it, Mabel said. Full amount, 90-day repayment schedule with 3% interest, which is below what the bank charges, and she knows it. She says, she paused, because this was the part that had made her eyes do the involuntary thing. She says she's glad to finally do something useful with the money her husband made her sign over. Crossed the room and took the letter and read it himself. She watched his face while he read. She watched the tightness go out of it, slowly, the way ice goes out of the ground in spring, not all at once, not dramatically, just a gradual release of something that has been frozen solid for a long time. She's your friend, he said. Yes, she did this because of you. She did it because it's a fair arrangement, Mabel said firmly. She'll be repaid. She'll be repaid because of you, he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. Because you're the one who made sure this place could pay what it owes. She looked at him. He was looking at her. The letter was between them, held loosely in his hand, and the kitchen was warm from the morning fire, and outside the Wyoming winter was pressing against everything with its usual indifference. He said her name. Just that, just Mabel. The way you say a word when the word is carrying more than it normally does. We should telegraph the bank, she said, before the end of the week. He didn't look away. We should, he said, yes. But neither of them moved for a moment, and in that moment the kitchen was very quiet, and the fire in the stove made its small sounds, and the cold outside went about its business. And Mabel Whitmore stood in the middle of a room that wasn't hers, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could accurately calculate, something that didn't have a clean, practical name. She stepped back first. I'll put the coffee on, she said. Did. And he stood there for another second, and then he folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket. Close, the way you keep something you're not ready to set down. Winnie appeared in the doorway a moment later, with her hair half braided, and a look that said she had not been asleep as long as anyone thought she had. Everything all right, she asked. Mabel set the coffee to heat. Yes, she said. Everything's all right. Winnie looked at her father, and then at Mabel, and then at her father again. And whatever she saw seemed to satisfy something in her, because she came into the kitchen and sat at the table and asked what was for breakfast. And Mabel told her, and started making it, and the morning continued the way mornings do forward, into whatever came next, without looking back at the moment that had just passed, or saying what it was, or deciding anything about it at all. That came later. Everything for now came later. The telegraph to the bank went out on a Thursday, and the confirmation came back on a Friday, and Caleb Rusk held that confirmation in his hand for a long time, before he folded it and put it with the letter from Mrs. Tolliver in the front room, in the small tin box where he kept documents that mattered. The deadline was still February 28th. That hadn't changed. The money was coming, wired from Cheyenne in 2 transfers, the first to cover the overdue amount, the second to cover the fees. Crane had added when he moved the deadline, and the bank had acknowledged receipt of the arrangement in writing. which meant Crane couldn't move the deadline again without putting himself in a position that even he would have difficulty explaining. Mabel understood that this was not victory, it was a stay, a breathing space. The mortgage still existed, the land was still leveraged, and a man named Crane still had reasons she didn't fully understand to want this property to fail. But the immediate crisis had been pushed back far enough that the ranch could function, and functioning was what they needed. She put it out of her mind and focused on February. February in Wyoming had a specific character. It was not the dramatic cold of January, the kind that announced itself with cracking pipes and ice in the water basin. February was quieter and in some ways more dangerous. It was the month when the novelty of winter had worn off, and the end of it wasn't close enough to feel real. People made mistakes from tiredness and inattention that they wouldn't have made in December. She'd seen it before in other cold places. The accidents happened in February. Tempers frayed in February. The small griefs that people had been managing since autumn had a way of surfacing in February when there was nothing left to distract from them. She tried to account for this in the way she ran the household. She varied the meals more than she had in January, not because she had more to work with, but because monotony was its own kind of drain. Kept the kitchen stocked with coffee at hours when the hands came in cold, and she said nothing when Pruitt sat at the table longer than necessary in the mornings, just warming his hands and staring at the wall with the look of a man waiting for February to be over. She let him sit. Sometimes that was what a person needed to sit somewhere warm without being required to be useful. Winnie had started teaching herself to read properly. She could read already, in the way of a child who had been taught the mechanics but hadn't yet had anyone sit with her long enough to make it pleasurable. Her mother had apparently been the one who read with her, and after Eleanor died that had stopped, not because Caleb didn't care, but because sitting still with a book in the evenings had become, for a while, something he couldn't do without it, feeling like an act of loss. Mabel started reading with her after supper. They sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and a book Mabel had brought in her trunk, a collection of short stories she'd read so many times the spine had given up, and Winnie read aloud, slowly, with the focused intensity she brought to everything. And Mabel corrected her when necessary, and didn't when it wasn't. And they made their way through the book at approximately 3 pages per evening. Caleb came in from the front room sometimes, and stood in the doorway and watched, and Mabel was careful not to look at him when he did, because looking at him in those moments felt like pressing on something that wasn't ready to be pressed. It was in the second week of February that the first real trouble arrived. Not the bank trouble, which had been practical and solvable. This kind was different. A woman came to the kitchen door. She was perhaps 50 thin in the way of someone who had been pretty once and had held on to it past the point where it was easy, with a good coat and careful hair and the air of a person accustomed to being received. She said her name was Mrs. Hadley and that she was newly arrived in Harrow Flats, having come from St. Louis to visit her daughter, and that she had heard from several people in town that there was a woman at the Bar R Ranch who had some talent with household management. Mabel had heard none of this before. She was immediately suspicious, not because the woman seemed threatening, but because, in her experience, a woman who arrived this precisely rarely arrived by accident. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Hadley?" she asked. "I'll be direct," Mrs. Hadley said, which was always a thing that people said when they intended to be slightly indirect. "My daughter and her husband run the mercantile on the east end of town. They've been struggling with the domestic side of their establishment meals, accounts, the management of their household, which is considerable. They've asked me to find someone suitable who might help. I heard your name from 2 separate sources and thought I'd call directly." Mabel looked at her. "What would the position involve?" she asked. "Full household management. Meals, accounts, staff coordination. They have 2 young children and a business to run, and my daughter has not been well since the winter. Compensation would be," Mrs. Hadley named a figure, "a real one, $12 a month, plus room and board in a separate bedroom with a door that locked." A room with a door that locked. The specific detail of it landed somewhere in Mabel's chest in a way she hadn't expected. "I'd need to think about it," she said. Mrs. Hadley smiled, a genuine one, not the calculated variety. "Of course, my daughter's name is Mrs. Frances Colm, the Mercantile on Elm Street. Come by any morning this week and she'll speak with you herself." She left. Mabel stood in the kitchen after she'd gone and looked at the stove and didn't do anything for a long moment. $12 a month. Wages, actual wages, written in an actual contract with an actual room at the end of the day that was hers in the way this room had never been hers. She looked at the corner where her trunk sat. Still there, still packed around the edges, with the things she hadn't entirely unpacked, because she'd understood, somewhere below conscious thought, that she wasn't staying, that she was a temporary condition, a solution to a specific problem, and that once the problem was solved, she would be what she'd always been, a woman, moving on to the next place. She opened the account book and looked at the wages column. All those weeks of empty space. The numbers Winnie had told her to write in so they wouldn't be forgotten. Closed the book. She didn't tell Caleb about Mrs. Hadley that evening. She told herself it was because there was nothing to tell. Yet she hadn't made a decision, but she knew that wasn't entirely the reason. The real reason was that she didn't know how to tell him, without it becoming a conversation she wasn't ready to have. She went to see Francis Colm 2 days later, on a Wednesday morning, when Caleb was out riding the fence line and the hands were occupied, and Winnie was at the schoolhouse in town. She told no one where she was going. Francis Colm was 31, pale, with the sunken look of someone who had been sick through the autumn and hadn't fully recovered. She was quiet and direct, and she did not perform the visit the way Mrs. Hadley had. She simply showed Mabel the kitchen, the accounts, the rooms, and told her plainly what she needed and what she could offer. And then she said, "I know you're currently at the Bar R. I know the situation there is complicated." Mabel looked at her. "I'm not trying to pry," Francis said. "I just want you to know that whatever the situation is, it won't affect my opinion of you. I need someone who can manage this household. My mother tells me you're that person. That's all I care about." Mabel looked around the room. It was not a bad room. It was, in fact, considerably better than the room at the Bar R, larger, with a south-facing window that would let in actual light, and the door that locked, and a small chest of drawers that would mean she could unpack her trunk properly for the first time since Cleveland. "Can I have until the end of the week?" Mabel asked. Francis said simply. Mabel walked back to the ranch. She had 3 days to decide, and she spent them with a clarity of purpose that felt slightly false, like a person who makes themselves very busy so they don't have to sit with an uncomfortable thought. She restocked the dry stores in quantities that would last through March. She made notes in the account book about the spring fence repairs and which sections needed priority. She wrote out, in clean, careful handwriting, a full record of every arrangement she'd made: the depot account, the renegotiated feed contract, scrap buyer Gus had found, the blacksmith agreement, so that whoever managed the household after her would have a working reference. Whoever managed the household after her. She sat with that phrase and felt its weight. On the second evening, Winnie came to find her in the kitchen while she was working on the notes, and sat across from her, without saying anything for a while, watching her write. "Are you leaving?" Winnie said. Mabel kept writing. "What makes you ask that?" "You're writing everything down," Winnie said. "Like you're explaining things to someone who isn't here yet." Mabel set down the pen. She looked at Winnie, this child who had her mother's name in a pocket she carried everywhere, and a stone and a ribbon and a crooked drawing, distributed in other people's trunks like anchors she was quietly dropping. 8 years old, and already understanding that the people you depended on were the people most likely to go. "I haven't decided anything," Mabel said. Carefully, truthfully. "But you're thinking about it." "Yes." Winnie absorbed this. She looked at the notes on the table, the careful handwriting, the organized columns. "Would it be better for you?" she asked. "Leaving?" Mabel thought about the locked door, the $12, the room with the south window. "In some ways," she said. "What ways?" She thought about how to answer an 8-year-old honestly, without giving her a burden that wasn't hers to carry. "I would have wages," she said, "and a room of my own." Winnie looked at the table. "You don't have wages here." "No." "Is that Papa's fault?" "It's nobody's fault," Mabel said. "It's just how things are." Winnie was quiet for a moment. "If you leave," she said, "will you come back?" Mabel didn't answer right away, because she knew that the kind answer and the honest answer were not the same answer, and Winnie was the kind of child who deserved honesty even when it hurt. "I don't know," she said. Winnie nodded. She accepted this the way she accepted most things, completely, without protest, the way a child does when they've learned that protest doesn't change what's real. She got up from the table and went to bed without another word, and Mabel sat alone in the kitchen with the notes and the account book and the lamp and the quiet pressed in from all sides. She had intended to tell Caleb the following morning. She had planned it. She would bring it up after breakfast, plainly, the way she handled everything, and she would tell him she'd had an offer and was considering it, and she would ask his opinion, not because she needed his permission, but because it seemed wrong to make the decision without telling him. What she hadn't planned was that Dorothea Crane would come back. She arrived on the third morning, Mabel's last day, before Frances Colm needed an answer, and this time she didn't come alone. She brought a woman Mabel didn't recognize, younger, with a notebook and a careful expression, and Dorothea introduced her as the wife of the county recorder, which meant nothing to Mabel immediately, and then meant something. "I thought you should know," Dorothea said, standing in the kitchen doorway with the composed certainty of someone delivering information they've been looking forward to delivering, "that my husband has brought a concern to the county recorder's office regarding this property." Mabel said nothing. "There appears to be a question," Dorothea continued, "about the original land grant for the Bar R. The paperwork from the territorial survey of 1871 contains a discrepancies in the boundary description. It may be nothing, but if it is something, it could affect the validity of the current deed." The woman with the notebook wrote something down. Mabel understood immediately what this was. This was not a legal concern. This was a manufactured legal concern, the kind that cost money to investigate and time to resolve, and that, even if it came to nothing, created enough uncertainty to scare off any creditor willing to work with a ranch under a cloud of title dispute, including potentially Mrs. Tolliver. "You'll need to inform Mr. Rusk, of course," Dorothea said pleasantly. "We're simply making sure all parties are aware." "Why?" Mabel said. Dorothea looked at her. "Why are you telling me?" Mabel said. "Why come here to the kitchen to tell the housekeeper about a county recorder's concern? Why not send a formal notice to the property owner?" A pause, brief but real. You thought you'd tell me," Mabel said, "because you thought I'd worry more than he would, or that I'd pass it on in a way that would do more damage, or that coming here to this kitchen and telling me to my face was a way of reminding me that I'm the one who doesn't belong, and you're the one who has the county recorder's office on call." She kept her voice completely flat. "Which of those was it?" "All three." Dorothea's expression had gone very still. "I'd like you to leave," Mabel said. "Both of you." The woman with the notebook stopped writing. "The notice," Dorothea said, recovering, "will be sent to Mr. Rusk formally by end of week. I was trying to give you time to." "The door," Mabel said, "is behind you." They left. She stood in the kitchen after they were gone, and her hands were not shaking this time. They had been shaking the first time. Now they were perfectly still, which she understood was not the same as being calm. It was the stillness that comes after something shifts past the point of being afraid of it. She knew what the land grant challenge meant. Even if it was fabricated, even if the discrepancy was the kind of clerical error that happened in every territorial survey and meant nothing, it would take a lawyer and time and money. They didn't have to prove that. Crane knew it. Crane had spent the last 2 months watching what Mabel had built here, watching the mortgage crisis get solved, watching the ranch stabilize. And this was his answer, not to attack the money directly, but to attack the ground the money was standing on. She went to find Caleb. He was in the barn, and when she told him, he went very quiet in the particular way she'd learned, meant he was holding something in. He set down the bridle he'd been working on and turned away from her for a moment, and she could see in the line of his back the effort of a man keeping himself from reacting in a way he'd regret. "A title dispute," he said, "on a property my family has held for 12 years. It may not go anywhere," Mabel said, "but you need to know before it does." "How did they get to the county recorder?" "Crane has connections there, or his wife does." She paused. It was Dorothea who came. "Not a formal notice. She came to the kitchen to tell me." Turned around. "She came to tell you?" "Yes." The quietness in his face had changed quality. "She's still trying to push you out," he said. "She's trying several things at once," Mabel said. "The title question is real enough that you need to take it seriously. Whether her motive is to push me out or to push you under, the result is the same." He picked up the bridle and set it down again. The way a person moves something when their hands need something to do. "Do we have a lawyer?" "Not currently. You'd need one." "A lawyer costs money." "Yes." He looked at her. "How much of what we saved from the supply changes do we have left after the mortgage payment?" She had this number. She always had the numbers. "After the first transfer from Mrs. Tolliver clears and the mortgage is paid and the fees are covered, approximately $31 in operational reserve." $31. A lawyer in Harrow Flats, if there even was one competent to handle a territorial title question, would likely cost more than that just to review the documents. "There's a land attorney in Casper," she said. "I asked Gus, who seems to know a great many things about this territory that nobody has thought to ask him. His name is Burley. He's handled territorial title work before. Caleb looked at her with the expression she now knew meant he was both impressed and slightly undone by how far ahead of him she consistently was. Did you write to him? I thought I should ask you first. He almost smiled at that. Not quite, Mabel. At this point, write to him. She nodded. And the original survey documents, he asked. They'll be at the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. We'd need copies. Can you write to them too? I already did, she said. Yesterday. Before I was sure I was right about what Dorothea was doing. I wanted the documents regardless. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, What would I have done? You'd have managed, she said. Same as she always said. Stop saying that, he said. Quietly. With something in it she wasn't prepared for. Stopped. I'm serious, he said. Stop telling me I would have managed. I wouldn't have. Not like this. Not through any of this. He moved a step closer and she held very still. I know you've had an offer. I know you've been thinking of leaving. She looked at him. Who told you, Winnie? He said it simply, without blame. She wasn't trying to make trouble. She was frightened, and she told me. Mabel thought about the child who had walked to bed without protest, accepting that the people you depended on went away. Of course she told him. Of course she had. It's a fair offer, Mabel said. Wages and a proper room. It would be wrong of me to pretend that doesn't matter. It matters, he said. And this situation keeps getting more complicated, she said. The title dispute. Crane. Whatever comes next. That's not what I agreed to. You didn't agree to anything, he said. That's the problem. You've been here since October doing more than I had any right to ask, and I haven't given you wages or a contract or any reason at all to stay. She was quiet. Tell me what you need, he said. Wages. Contract. Something in writing that says your position here is real, and not just something I'm allowing out of. He stopped. Chose the next word carefully. Need Caleb, she said. I know what I'm asking you to stay for, he said. I'm not going to pretend it's just the ranch. The barn was very quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up the kind of February wind that comes with intention, and it moved along the walls and found the gaps, and made its presence known in the way of things that don't care much whether you're ready for them. You have a title dispute, she said, and her voice was almost steady, and a mortgage you just negotiated, and a daughter who needs continuity more than she needs another change. This is not the time. I know, he said. Then why are you saying it? Because you're about to leave, he said, and I'd rather say it wrong at the wrong time than not say it at all. She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the barn around them, the repaired harness on the wall, the dry wood in the stack, the hay that was stored correctly now, all the smalls accumulated evidence of months of work that had made this place different than it had been. I'll write to the attorney, she said, and I'll send the request to the land office. And he said, and I'll answer Mrs. Colm by the end of the week, she said. He waited. I haven't decided yet, she said. I need you to let me have the time. He nodded. He picked up the bridle for the third time, and this time he started actually working on it. She went back to the house. The next morning brought a development nobody had anticipated. Gus came to the kitchen before breakfast, looking more animated than she'd ever seen him, which in practical terms meant he'd come inside instead of waiting to be found, and he said more than 3 words in a row. That woman who came yesterday, he said with the notebook. She's not the recorder's wife. Mabel looked at him. What? I know the recorder's wife. Martha Elgin. I've known her for 8 years. That woman yesterday wasn't her. He said it the way he said everything, flat, certain, without embellishment. I saw her leaving when I came in from the west pasture. I didn't think much of it until last night. And I thought about it. Mabel stood very still. Who do you think she was? She said. Don't know, Gus said. But she had a notebook and she was writing things down in Mrs. Crane was introducing her as somebody she wasn't. He paused. Thought you should know. He left. She stood in the kitchen and thought about the woman with the notebook, writing things down, looking at the kitchen, the room, the layout of the house. Not a county recorder's wife at all. Someone Dorothea had brought for a different reason to observe something, or document something, or assess something. What would a person assess, standing in Mabel Whitmore's kitchen? The answer arrived with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. Property, the house, the improvements. Crane didn't just want to foreclose, he wanted to buy, and if he was going to buy at a distressed price, he needed to know what he was getting. He'd sent someone to look at the house under the cover of a social call, wrapped in the authority of a county office that wasn't actually there, relying on the fact that the woman in the kitchen wouldn't know the difference. She had known the difference. She'd made them leave. But not before the woman with the notebook had been standing in this kitchen for 10 minutes, looking at everything. She wrote 3 letters that morning, one to Attorney Burley in Casper, one to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, and one to Mrs. Tolliver in Cheyenne, not asking for more money, but asking a question she'd been turning over since the previous evening, whether Mrs. Tolliver knew anyone in the territorial government's land registry office who might be willing to look at whether the process of raising a title dispute against an established deed required specific evidence or could be initiated on a manufactured discrepancy alone. She wasn't a lawyer. She didn't pretend to understand all of it. But she understood that the best way to defend against a manufactured problem was to understand exactly how it had been manufactured, and you couldn't do that from a distance with no information. By the time Caleb came in for the midday meal, the letters were sealed, and she gave them to Pruitt to take to town with the weekly supply run. "Anything I should know about those?" Caleb asked. "The attorney, the land office, and a question to Mrs. Tolliver," she said. He nodded. He sat down at the table. He looked at the meal she'd put out, nothing elaborate. It was the middle of the week, and he ate it. And she ate across from him. And Winnie came in from the schoolhouse and ate between them. For a while, the conversation was about nothing consequential: Winnie's arithmetic lessons, a loose board on the front porch that needed a nail, whether the weather was going to break before March. Normal, ordinary, the small, unremarkable texture of a day, under which ran, like water under ice, everything that hadn't been resolved and wouldn't be resolved until she had decided about the offer, about this place, about what she was willing to be accountable for and what she wasn't. That evening, she sat alone in her room with the trunk open and looked at the things in the top: stone, the ribbon, the folded drawing. She looked at them for a long time, and then she closed the trunk and sat on the edge of the bed in the small that wasn't hers. And she finally quietly let herself answer the question she'd been avoiding. Not out loud. She wasn't ready for out loud. But inside, where the calculations lived, she let the answer take its shape. She would write to Francis Colm in the morning. She knew what the letter would say. What she didn't know yet couldn't know. Sitting on the edge of the bed in the February dark was what that decision was going to cost her, and what it was going to ask of her, and how much worse things were going to get before Crane finally showed his whole hand, and she could see clearly enough to know how to fight it. The wind moved along the walls of the house and found the gaps, the way it always did, the way things always do when they're looking for a way in. Turned down the lamp and sat in the dark, and let February do what February does: press in, wear down, make everything feel slightly harder than it was. She let it do that, and then she breathed through it, and then she lay down and closed her eyes. And outside the Bar Ranch sat in its frozen fields under the winter dark, still standing, still holding, still waiting to see what came next. The letter to Francis Colm went out on a Friday morning, and it said what Mabel had decided in the dark the night before. She had written it 3 times. The first version was too long. It explained too much, justified too much, the way a person writes when they're not entirely sure they're making the right choice, and they want the words to carry the weight of the uncertainty. The second version was too short, almost cold, which wasn't fair to Francis, who had been nothing but decent. Third version was what she sent: brief, direct, grateful for the offer, and clear that she would not be accepting it. She did not give reasons beyond saying that her current situation required her continued presence. She signed it Mabel Whitmore, without title, because she still didn't have one. She didn't tell Caleb she'd sent it. She didn't tell Winnie either. She put it in Pruitt's pile for the town run, and went back to the kitchen and started on the midday meal, and didn't think about it again, or tried not to, which was not entirely the same thing. What she thought about instead was Attorney Burley in Casper, and how long it would take for a letter to get there, and a response to come back, and whether there was a faster way to get information about the title dispute that didn't require waiting 3 weeks for correspondence to travel in both directions across Wyoming in February. There was, it turned out. Gus knew a man. Gus appeared to know a man for most things that needed knowing, which Mabel had begun to appreciate as one of the more valuable and under-acknowledged resources on the Bar Ranch. The man in question was a former land surveyor named Delacroix, who now lived in semi-retirement in Harrow Flats and spent most of his time drinking coffee at the general store and being ignored by people who didn't realize he'd spent 20 years surveying territorial boundaries and knew more about land grant law than most practicing attorneys in the state. "He drinks coffee at Featherstone's every morning," Gus said, "from 7 to 9, if you wanted to talk to him." "Does he talk to people?" Mabel asked. "He talks to people who ask him things he finds interesting," Gus said. Most people don't ask him things he finds interesting. She went to Featherstone's general store the following morning at 7:30, which required getting the kitchen organized before 6, the breakfast done and cleared before Caleb noticed she was moving differently than usual, and the 4-mile walk to town completed in time. She was there by 7:25, which left her slightly short of breath and with a blister on her right heel that she chose to ignore. Delacroix was a small man in his late 60s, with the kind of face that had spent so many years in sun and wind that it had given up trying to look any particular age. He was on his second cup of coffee when she introduced herself, and he looked at her the way a man looks when he's trying to decide if a person is going to waste his time. Told him what she needed. She told him plainly the bar deed. The 1,871 territorial survey, the discrepancy Crane had filed with the county recorder's office, and what she understood about how title disputes were initiated in this territory. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he drank his coffee and was quiet for a moment. The 1,871 surveys, he said, were done by a man named Carver. I worked with Carver. He was thorough, but his boundary notation was non-standard. He used a modified chain measurement that wasn't consistent with the notation manual that came out of Washington that year. He paused, which means almost every deed he filed has what looks like a discrepancy if you compare it to the standard notation. She looked at him. It means nothing, he said. Any land attorney familiar with Carver's work knows that. Been challenged before, twice in this county alone, and both times the territorial court ruled the deeds valid because the measurement itself was accurate, even if the notation wasn't standard. Who challenged it before, she asked. He named 2 cases. He named the dates. He named the ruling judge. She wrote all of it down. Whoever told Crane about this discrepancy, Delacroix said, either didn't know about the previous rulings, or knew and thought he could get away with it anyway. Which do you think it is? He looked at her with something that was almost amusement. I think a man like Crane doesn't do anything without knowing exactly what he's doing. She thanked him, paid for his 3rd cup of coffee. He accepted this without ceremony and walked back to the ranch with the information and the blister and a clearer picture of what she was dealing with. The letter from Attorney Burley arrived 12 days later. It said substantially what Delacroix had told her in Featherstone's store, with more legal terminology and a bill for the consultation that she had already anticipated and set aside from the operational reserve. More importantly, it included one piece of information Delacroix hadn't had, the name of the person who had actually filed the title challenge with the county recorder's office. It was not Crane directly. It was a land acquisition company registered in Cheyenne called the Western Territorial Holdings Group, acting as a third party. She read this 3 times. A land acquisition company, acting on behalf of someone or appearing to act independently, which was not the same thing. This was not the move of a man who simply wanted to delay a mortgage payment. This was the move of someone who had been planning to acquire this property for longer than the current crisis had been running. She brought the letter to Caleb that evening. He read it. He set it down. He picked it up and read it again. Western Territorial Holdings Group, he said. I've never heard of them. Neither had Burley, before he looked into them, she said. He says they were incorporated 14 months ago. They've filed challenges on 4 other properties in this territory in the last year. 4 others, Caleb said. All within the same 3-county area, she said. All properties with some version of a Carver survey notation. He looked at her. Someone's been finding these properties deliberately. Yes. And Crane is either connected to this company or Burley thinks he may be a partner, she said, in a structure designed so the bank's involvement isn't visible. The bank calls the mortgage. The company files the title dispute. Property becomes difficult to sell or refinance. The foreclosure happens, and then the company buys at a fraction of the value. She let that sit. Clean. Legally, it's very clean. He was quiet for a long time. This has nothing to do with me personally, he said finally. Or with you. It's just my land. Your land is in the right place at the right time, she said. For them. He stood up and went to the window and looked out at the dark. She watched him do this, watched the particular stillness of a man who had thought he understood the shape of his trouble, and was now learning it was larger and more deliberate than he'd known. There is a specific kind of anger that comes with that. Not hot anger, cold anger, with the quality of something that has been gathering for a long time and has just found its reason. What do we do? He said. Burley says the previous court rulings are precedent, she said. The title challenge goes to the territorial court. We win. But it takes time, 3-4 months at minimum. And Crane likely knows that. The challenge itself is the weapon, not the outcome. Then what's the defense? We need to make it public, she said. Not in a dramatic way, in a practical way. We need the other property owners who've had challenges from this company to know what we know about the previous rulings so they can use the same precedent. And we need someone with standing in this community to understand what Crane is doing. Because a man this to one ranch can be dismissed as a business dispute, but a man doing this to 5 ranches with a pattern starts to look like something else. He turned around. You've been thinking about this for a while, he said. Since the letter came, she said. 3 days. Who has standing, he said. In this community, who would people listen to? She had thought about this too. There's a county commissioner who attends the church in town, she said. A man named Aldridge. Featherstone mentioned him in a context that suggested he's not friendly to Crane's type of business. Aldridge, Caleb said. I know him slightly. Not slightly enough, she asked. I'll make it enough, he said. And there was something in his voice that was different. From the tone, she usually heard something harder, with an edge to it, the tone of a man who has finished being on the back foot and has decided to stand up. She didn't plan to be there for the meeting with Aldridge. She prepared it. She organized the documents. The Burley letter, her notes from Delacroix, the list of 4 other challenged properties, and she put them in order and made them clear and handed them to Caleb on the morning he rode into town. You should come, he said. It'll go better without me, she said. A man talking to another man about property is a different conversation than the same conversation with a woman in it. He started to object. I'm not saying it's right, she said. I'm saying it's true. You need Aldridge to take this seriously, and the fastest way to that is without any complications. He looked at her with an expression that said he didn't like it and knew she was correct. Come in behind, he said. Give me an hour with him and then come in if I need you. She agreed to this, and she spent the hour in Featherstone's store buying supplies and listening to the general store conversation with the attentive quiet she'd developed over years of being the kind of woman who got underestimated in rooms. She heard 2 things of interest in that hour. The first was that the Western Territorial Holdings Group had sent a representative to Harrow Flats the previous week, a man who had spent 2 days in town meeting with various people and had then left on the Friday stage. Nobody seemed entirely sure who he'd spoken to, but he'd been seen coming out of the bank. The second thing she heard was from Mrs. Halverson's niece, who was buying thread and mentioned that Mrs. Crane had been ill the last week and hadn't left the house. Mabel found this second piece of information interesting, not because she had any feeling about Dorothea Crane's health, but because a woman who had made it her business to be involved in her husband's business affairs would not have sent a false county recorder's wife to inspect a kitchen and then taken to bed the following week unless something had changed in the situation that required her to step back. She went to meet Caleb at the hour. He was still in the meeting. She waited on the bench outside the commissioner's office for 20 minutes before the door opened, and Caleb came out with Aldridge behind him. Aldridge was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with the looks of someone who had been a farmer before he was a commissioner and hadn't forgotten it. He looked at her. You're the woman who wrote to the Territorial Land Office, he said. I did, she said. And you found Delacroix. He was at the general store. Aldridge nodded slowly. The other 4 properties, he said. Do you have the addresses? She produced the list from her coat pocket. He took it and looked at it. The Mercer place, he said. And the Lundquist homestead, he looked up. I know these people. I thought you might, she said. He looked at her for a moment, with the particular look of a man recalibrating. It wasn't an unfriendly look. It was the look of someone who had walked into a situation expecting to find one thing and was finding something more organized. Come inside, he said. Both of you. The meeting lasted another 2 hours. By the end of it, Aldridge had committed to contacting the other 4 property owners. He had also committed to writing to the Territorial Attorney General's office. Not with accusations, he was careful about that. Careful in the way of a politician who understood what he could prove versus what he suspected, but with an inquiry about the Western Territorial Holdings Group's pattern of activity and the legal standing of challenges based on Carver notation discrepancies. This doesn't happen fast, he said when they were getting up to leave. You understand that. Crane has influence in this county, and he hasn't done anything that's overtly illegal. What he's done is construct a system that uses legal tools in an illegal way, which is harder to attack, Mabel said. But it's attackable, Aldridge said. And it's harder to do quietly when 5 families know what the system is. He walked them out. At the door he paused and looked at Mabel again. How long have you been at the bar? Since October, she said. And before that, Cleveland, she said. Before that, various places. He nodded. He didn't ask more, which she appreciated. Carver notation argument, he said. Where did you get the case precedents? Delacroix, she said. And Burley and Casper confirmed them. You talked to Burley by letter. Aldridge looked at Caleb. You've got someone good here, he said. Not admiringly, exactly. Matter-of-factly. The tone of a man who assessed things practically and called them what they were. Caleb looked at her. I know, he said. The ride back to the ranch was mostly quiet. The road was muddy now, the cold had begun. In the last week, to soften towards something that wasn't quite spring, but was less aggressively winter. And the ground was doing the ambiguous thawing work it did in late February, which made it neither properly frozen nor properly dry, but something unpleasant in between. Halfway back, Caleb said, He's right, you know. She was watching the road. About what? That I have someone good here? He paused. It's an inadequate way to put it, but it's what he said, and I agreed with it. It was an adequate meeting, she said, because of the documents you prepared. Because you knew Aldridge, and he trusted you enough to listen. Mabel, he said, the same way he'd said it in the barn, with that particular weight. She had started to recognize that weight and what it meant, and she was still not sure what to do with it. We should talk to the hands when we get back, she said. They should know what's happening with the title question. They have a stake in this, too. He was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. Yes. She appreciated that he let her redirect. She appreciated it, and she also understood that he was only letting her redirect because he had decided to be patient, which meant the conversation was not finished, only deferred, the way the thaw was deferred, happening underneath, even when the surface still looked like winter. Dearborn took the news about the title dispute badly. Not toward Mabel, that era appeared to be genuinely over. He took it badly, in the way of a man who had been on this land for 11 years and understood that what was being threatened was not just the owner's property, but his own livelihood and his own place in the world, and that understanding sat in him heavy and dark. I've worked this land since before Rusk's father died, he said, sitting at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands, in the particular posture of a man who needed somewhere to put his worry. I know this fence line better than any survey ever will. That's part of the argument, Mabel said. Contiguous use and occupation matters in territorial land law. He looked at her. Is that true? Yes, Burley mentioned it. If the deed challenge fails, and it should fail, the history of this property being actively worked is part of what supports the original grant. Quiet. He turned his hat in his hands. What can I do? He asked. Question surprised her, not because it was unexpected. From a practical standpoint, Dearborn was a useful man who was sitting in front of her, telling her he wanted to be useful, but because of the way he asked it. Without the edge he'd had in October. Without the positioning. Write down what you know, she said. The fence lines, the pasture boundaries, the water sources, where they are and have always been. A written record of your knowledge of this property. If it goes to the territorial court, that kind of testimony from a long-term hand matters. He nodded. He put his hat back on. He said, I'll need help with the spelling. I'll help you, she said. He nodded again and left the kitchen, and Mabel stood there for a moment, understanding that this was what months of quiet work sometimes looked like when it finally turned, not dramatically, not with any announcement. Just a man who had moved things around her kitchen for 2 weeks back in October, now asking her to help him write down what he knew, because he trusted her to handle it correctly. She started a new page in the ledger. She dated it. She labeled it. Property Knowledge Record J. Dearborn. She left it on the table for him to find in the morning. The last week of February arrived with the first real hint of weather change, not warmth yet, but a different quality to the cold, less aggressive, as though winter was deciding to stop insisting. The mortgage payment transferred on the 24th. Caleb rode to the bank himself to confirm it, because he wanted to look at whoever was behind the teller window when he handed over the confirmation of transfer, and he wanted them to see that the bar R was still standing. He told her this when he came back. Was Crane there? She asked. No, he said. His office was closed. I asked and was told he was dealing with a personal matter. Dorothea, she thought, still ill, or the beginning of something unraveling. Payment was accepted, she said. Without comment, he said. Stamped and recorded. She let out a breath she hadn't entirely realized she'd been holding. The mortgage was current. The deadline had passed without incident. The title dispute was still pending with the county recorder, but Aldridge had already sent his letter to the Attorney General, Two of the other four property owners, the Mercer family, and a homesteader named Briggs, she hadn't heard of before, had been in contact with Aldridge and were prepared to join a collective response. The Western Territorial Holdings Group was no longer operating in the dark. It wasn't over. She knew it wasn't over. Men like Crane didn't stop. Because their first move failed, they regrouped, and they came back with something different. And she understood that there would be more moves before this was finished. But the immediate crisis had passed, and the ranch was standing, and the mortgage was paid, and there were people in this county who now understood what had been happening and were not going to pretend otherwise. She poured Caleb a cup of coffee and set it in front of him, and sat down across the table and let herself feel briefly the simple fact of that. "We should talk," he said. "We've been talking," she said, "about the mortgage, Crane, Aldridge, the title dispute." "Not about that," he said. She looked at him. "About you," he said. "About what happens now." She wrapped her hands around her own cup. "Now we wait for the territorial court to deal with the title dispute, and we repair the east fence come spring, and we renegotiate the cattle contract before summer." "Mabel." She stopped. He looked at her across the table with the directness she'd always had from him, even when it was inconvenient. "You wrote to Mrs. Colm," he said. "You turned down the position." "Yes. You told me you hadn't decided." "I hadn't," she said. "And then I decided why." She looked at her cup. She looked at the table. She looked at him. "Because leaving would have been the sensible thing," she said. "And I have been sensible my entire life, and I have very little to show for it. So I thought I would try something different." He was very quiet. "I want wages," she said, "a real amount, written in a contract. I want my position here to be something that exists on paper, not just by your tolerance." "Yes," he said. "Whatever you say it should be." "I'll say what it should be," she said firmly, "and it won't be subject to argument." "All right." "And I want—" She stopped. He waited. "I want things to be clear," she said. "What this is. What it isn't. I've spent months in a situation that wasn't clear, and I'd like it to be clear." He looked at her steadily. "What would clear look like?" She met his eyes and held them. "I don't know yet," she said. "I need you to give me time to figure that out without pressure." "Can do that," he said. And then quietly, "I've been waiting since October. I'm good at waiting." She looked at him for a moment. Something in her chest moved, slightly, like ice on a river when the thaw starts not breaking, just shifting. "Write up the contract," she said. "Whatever you think the wage should be, write it and show me, and we'll negotiate from there like adults." $12 a month, he said. "Same as the Colm offer." "That was their opening number," she said. "Don't tell me you don't know how to negotiate." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. The ghost of the smile she'd been watching passed through him since October. 13, he said. 15, she said. 14, he said. "And it goes up in the fall if the ranch shows what I think it will." She looked at him. "Put it in writing." "Tonight," he said. She nodded. She picked up her cup. He picked up his. They sat across from each other in the kitchen of the Bar R Ranch at the end of February, with the mortgage paid and the title dispute moving through the right channels and the east fence waiting for spring. And the coffee was not particularly good. She'd been trying to stretch the supply and had been slightly too economical with the grounds. And neither of them mentioned that, because there were things you let go when the bigger things had finally settled. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew, sitting in that kitchen, was that 2 days later a man named Vickers would arrive in Harrow Flats on the Thursday stage. He came with a leather satchel and a letter of introduction from the Territorial Attorney General's office, and he was not the kind of man who announced himself in advance. He had been, for the previous 6 years, a federal land fraud investigator, working primarily in territories where patterns of coordinated foreclosure and title manipulation had been identified. Aldridge's letter had landed on the right desk at exactly the right moment, or perhaps not exactly the right moment, but a moment that had been prepared by everything that had come before it. Vickers checked in at Mrs. Halverson's boarding house and spent his first afternoon in Harrow Flats in the county recorder's office, going through the title dispute filings for the past 18 months. He had a quiet manner and a methodical approach, and he didn't talk to many people that first day. The first person outside the recorder's office he talked to was Aldridge. The second was Delacroix, still at Featherstone's with his coffee. The third, on the following morning, was Mabel Whitmore, because Aldridge had told him that the organized documentation of the Bar R's case had come primarily from her, and that if he wanted to understand how the pattern had been assembled and identified, she was the person who could show him most efficiently. He arrived at the ranch at 9 in the morning. She saw him coming up the road from the kitchen window, a compact man in a dark coat, with the slightly deliberate walk of someone who moves through unfamiliar places carefully and without hurry. She had the account book, the Burley letter, the Delacroix notes, the list of 5 properties, and the property knowledge record that Dearborn had dictated, and she had written in a neat stack on the kitchen table by the time he knocked. She opened the door. He looked at her with the assessing directness of a man who interviewed people for a living and had learned not to waste either his time or theirs. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mrs.," she said, though it's a long time since it was current. He tested this without comment. "I'm told you put together the picture of what's been happening with Western Territorial Holdings." With help, she said. Gus knew Delacroix. Delacroix knew the survey history. Burley knew the legal precedent. Aldridge knew the community. I just organized what they knew. He looked at the stack on the table. "May I?" "Sit down," she said. "I'll get coffee." She got the coffee. She sat across from him while he went through the documents, carefully and methodically, without rushing, making small marks in a notebook he'd brought. She answered his questions when he had them. She did not elaborate beyond what was asked, because she understood that a man like this was drawing his own picture, and her job was to give him accurate materials, not to tell him what to draw. He was there for 2 hours. When he finished, he closed the notebook and looked at her. "The woman who came with Mrs. Crane," he said. "The one your hand saw leaving. Can you describe her?" She described her. He wrote it down. "The representative from Western Territorial Holdings who visited town last week," he said. "Did you get a name?" "No, but Featherstone saw him. And Mrs. Halverson will know which room he stayed in and how long." He nodded. He put his notebook away. He stood up, and she stood up, and they shook hands across the kitchen table, not the social shake of an introduction, but the direct shake of 2 people who have just done a piece of work together and both know it. "This is going to take some time," he said. "I want you to understand that. Whatever's happened here may be connected to a much larger structure, and those things don't resolve quickly." "I know," she said. "You may be asked to provide testimony at some point," he said, "about what you observed, the documents you compiled. Would you be willing?" She thought about Dorothea Crane standing in this kitchen, taking off her gloves 1 finger at a time. She thought about the woman with the notebook, who wasn't the recorder's wife. She thought about $312 and a move deadline and a title dispute built on a notation discrepancy that had been challenged and dismissed twice before. "Yes," she said, "I'd be willing." He left. Stood at the kitchen window and watched him walk back down the road toward town with his leather satchel and his deliberate, unhurried walk. And she thought about what he'd said, that it would take time, that it might be connected to something larger, and she found that this did not frighten her. It had frightened her in October, the size of what she'd walked into. It had frightened her in January, when the deadline moved and the math didn't work. It had frightened her in February, standing in the barn with Caleb, saying things she wasn't ready to hear. But somewhere in the accumulated weight of the months between then and now, the fear had changed character. It was still there, she wasn't foolish enough to think it wasn't, but it had become a working fear, a functional one, the kind that sharpens attention rather than freezing it. Caleb came in from the barn at midday and found her still at the window. "Who was that?" he said. She turned around. "A federal investigator," she said, "from the Territorial Attorney General." He stopped moving. "Vickers," she said. "He's looking at Western Territorial Holdings. Probably at Crane." He stared at her. "He's been here 2 days," she said. "I think Aldridge's letter worked." Caleb sat down in the chair that Vickers had just vacated and looked at the table with the stack of documents she'd assembled, slightly rumpled now from having been gone through, but still ordered, still clear, still exactly what it had been. "Put that together," he said. "We all did," she said. "Together." He looked at the table for another moment. Then he looked at her, and his expression had the quality of a man who has been carrying a weight for a very long time and has just realized it is genuinely lighter than it was not gone, not resolved, but lighter, held from more than one side now. "Contract," he said. "I wrote it last night. It's on the desk in the front room. I'll read it after dinner," she said. $14, he said. "We'll see," she said, and went back to the stove, and outside the last of February moved toward March with the slow, unhurried pace of seasons that don't care about the things happening beneath them. And the Barr Ranch stood in its muddy fields, with its patched fences and its repaired root cellar and its stack of careful documents, still standing, still holding, having made it through the worst of winter into whatever came next. Contract was $14 a month, with the clause that said it would be reviewed in September based on the ranch's financial position. She read it twice at the kitchen table after dinner, while Caleb sat in the front room, pretending to do something with the account books, and Winnie sat across from her, pretending to read but watching Mabel's face instead. She made 2 changes. She crossed out the language about the September review being at Caleb's discretion and wrote in that it would be mutual. And she added a line specifying that the position was household manager, not housekeeper, because the words were different, and she wanted the right one on paper. She signed it and left it on the desk in the front room. In the morning, it was back on the kitchen table with Caleb's signature under hers, and no comment about the changes she'd made. She put it in her trunk in the top, with the stone and the ribbon and the folded drawing. Then she unpacked the rest of the trunk properly for the first time since she'd arrived, her clothes hung, her books stacked, her things arranged in the small room, the way a person arranges things when they've decided they're not just passing through. It took about 20 minutes. When she was done, she stood in the middle of the room and looked at it, and it looked like a room where someone lived, which was not something she'd had in a while. And she let that be what it was, without trying to make it larger or smaller than the simple fact of it. She went back to the kitchen and started on breakfast. March came in with the ambiguous weather of a season that hadn't decided what it wanted to be yet. Warm days that raised false hope, followed by nights that still dropped below freezing. The ground going soft and then hard again in alternating confusion. The mud was considerable. Everyone on the ranch spent the first 2 weeks of March tracking it inside and then cleaning it up. A cycle that produced a low-grade irritation in everyone that Mabel managed by keeping a boot scraper at the back door and saying nothing about the mud that made it past the scraper, because there were battles worth having, and that wasn't one of them. Vickers had been in Harrow Flats for nearly 2 weeks by then, quiet and methodical, going through records and talking to people with the unhurried patience of a man who understood that the thing he was building couldn't be rushed without being broken. He came back to the ranch once more in that first week of March to ask Mabel 2 follow-up questions about the timeline of Dorothea Crane's visits and to get a written account of what the woman with the notebook had done and said during the 10 minutes she'd been in the kitchen. Mabel gave him both things precisely and without embellishment. "Crane aware you're here?" Caleb asked him, when Vickers was putting on his coat to leave. "Probably," Vickers said. "Men in his position usually have enough connections to know when someone from the Attorney General's office is in town. It won't change what we find. It might change how fast things move." "How does it change how fast things move?" Mabel asked. He looked at her. "It tends to accelerate things," he said. "People who know they're being investigated sometimes make decisions that make the investigation simpler." He left. She thought about that for the rest of the day. What Crane did, as it turned out, was resign from the bank. The news came through Featherstone's store on a Thursday news in Harrow. Flats traveled through the general stores, the way water travels through rock, slowly and with absolute certainty, and by the time Pruitt brought it back to the ranch on the supply run, it had accumulated the usual layers of speculation and embellishment. Core of it was accurate. Harlan Crane had submitted his resignation to the bank's board effective immediately, citing personal health reasons, and he and Dorothea had closed their house in town and left for Denver on the Wednesday evening stage. Gus heard this and said nothing. Dearborn heard it and said, "Rats leave the ship when they know it's going down." Pruitt heard it and looked at Mabel with an expression that seemed to be asking whether this was good news or bad, and she said, "It's information. We'll see what it means." What it meant became clearer over the following week. Vickers, it turned out, had not been in Harrow Flat solely about the Bar R. The Attorney General's office had been building a case around Western Territorial Holdings. For several months before Aldridge's letter arrived, Aldridge's letter, with its organized documentation and its specific precedent citations, provided the local evidence they'd been lacking to connect the company's activities in this county to a larger structure that extended into 3 other territories. Crane's involvement was one node in something considerably bigger, which was why Vickers had been so careful and so patient, and why the case had not resolved in a week or a month. Mabel learned this from Aldridge, who came out to the ranch on a Saturday in mid-March and sat at the kitchen table and told them both what he could tell them, which was not everything, but was enough. "The title dispute against the Bar R will be withdrawn," Aldridge said. "The company is dissolving its Wyoming filings. Whether Crane faces anything beyond professional consequences depends on what the federal investigation finds, and that's not our jurisdiction." "The other 4 properties?" Mabel said. "Same. The challenges will be withdrawn." He paused. The Mercer family had already spent money on legal fees. Question of whether that's recoverable. Burley thinks it might be in a civil action, but that's a longer road. The bank, Caleb said. The mortgage. The bank is under new management, effectively. The board moved quickly when Crane resigned. Existing mortgages are valid and will be honored at their original terms. Aldridge looked at him steadily. You're on solid ground, Mr. Your deed is clean, your mortgage is current, and the people who were trying to take this property are gone. There was a silence. It was not the dramatic silence of a scene in a story where the music swells. It was the quiet, slightly stunned silence of people sitting in a kitchen in the middle of a March morning, trying to absorb the fact that something they had been braced against for months was no longer coming. Caleb put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. Mabel looked at the account book on the shelf. Winnie, who had been sitting in the doorway, doing her reading lesson, and had been pretending not to listen, looked up from the book and said, "Does that mean it's over?" Aldridge looked at her. "Yes, young lady," he said. "I believe it does." Winnie looked at Mabel. Mabel nodded once, and Winnie went back to her book. And the kitchen continued to be a kitchen, which was the most ordinary and necessary thing in the world. Spring came properly in the last week of March, not gently, because nothing in Wyoming came gently, but with the forceful intention of a season that had been waiting long enough and was done waiting. The snow came off the fields in the space of about 5 days, running off in channels that Mabel mapped mentally for future drainage planning. The ground softened. The fence repair work that had been deferred all winter became possible, and Caleb and the hands started on the east line. She did not stand around watching them work. There was plenty of her own work. Spring inventory, the restocking orders, the renegotiation of the cattle contract she'd mentioned to Caleb in February. Cattle contract took 3 separate trips to town and one very long conversation with a buyer named Tatum, who had the negotiating instincts of a man who expected to always win and the slight confusion of a man encountering someone who wouldn't let him. Came back from the 3rd conversation with a contract price that was 11% above what Caleb had gotten the previous year. And when she put it on the table, Caleb read it and then read it again and then said, "How?" He wanted to close quickly, she said. "I was willing to wait." He didn't know that. He found out, she said. Dearborn, who was at the table for this conversation, made a sound that in another man might have been a laugh. In Dearborn, it was a brief exhale through the nose. But it counted the letter from Mrs. Tolliver arrived in early April, and it contained 2 things. The first was a confirmation that the first repayment installment from the Bar R had been received and recorded. The second was a personal note, separate from the business letter, which said that she was glad the ranch had survived the winter, and that she expected to be traveling through Wyoming in June and hoped to stop at Harrow Flats, if that was acceptable, and meet the people whose situation she had invested in. Mabel wrote back immediately and told her she was very welcome. Told Caleb about the visit over dinner. "Your friend from Cheyenne," he said. "Yes, in June," he nodded. "I'd like to thank her properly," he said. "She took a risk on this place." "She took a risk on my judgment," Mabel said. "They're not entirely the same thing." He looked at her. "You're going to have to let me say thank you eventually," he said. "You keep explaining away everything you've done." "I'm not explaining it away," she said. "I'm being accurate." "You're being modest," he said, which isn't the same thing as accurate. Winnie looked up from her plate. "She does that," she said. "She always says other people did it." Mabel looked at the child. "Eat your dinner." "I am eating," Winnie said. "I can eat and talk." "You can eat and be quiet," Mabel said. And Winnie made a face but went back to her plate. And Caleb looked at his own plate with that ghost of a smile that had become, over the months, slightly more substantial, less ghost, more actual smile, appearing more often and staying longer. She noticed this and said nothing about it, and was glad of it in a way she didn't examine too carefully. Conversation she had known was coming happened on an evening in mid-April, when the work had settled into the manageable rhythm of spring, and Winnie was asleep, and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and the kitchen was quiet in the way it was. Quiet after everyone else had left it not empty but rested. Caleb had been sitting at the table longer than necessary, with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and she had been doing the week's accounts. And they had been in the same room for an hour in the comfortable silence that had developed between them over months, and that she had come to value exactly as it was, which made what she knew was coming both easier and harder. "I want to talk to you," he said. "All right," she said, and put the pen down. He looked at the table for a moment. He was a man who said things plainly when he finally said them, but who took time getting there, and she had learned to wait him out. I know what I said in the barn, he said, and I know what you told me about needing time. I've given you time you have, she said. It's been 2 months. Yes. I'm not rushing you, he said. I want to be clear that I'm not rushing you. But I want to say something, and I need you to hear it fully, not as something to be redirected or filed away. She folded her hands on the table and looked at him. I'm not good at this, he said. I wasn't particularly good at it even before Eleanor, and after I went a long time without being any kind of person in that direction. I'm probably going to say this wrong. Say it anyway, she said. He looked at her. You came here with $11 and a trunk and a letter for a hotel that didn't exist anymore. Could have gone back. You almost went somewhere else in February, and you didn't. You says it's in this house through the worst winter I've had in 12 years on this land, and you didn't get paid for the first 4 months of it, and you didn't complain once. You fixed things I didn't know were broken. You fought a fight that wasn't yours to fight, and you fought it better than I did. He paused. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you what means to me without it sounding like I'm grateful for the work. Because I am grateful for the work, but that's not what I'm trying to say. She waited. I'm trying to say that I love you, he said. That's what I'm trying to say. And I'm aware that it's not a simple thing to say given the situation, and I'm aware you may have thoughts about that are more complicated than mine, and I'm prepared to hear all of them. But I needed you to know it as a fact, not as a question, just as a thing that is. The kitchen was very still. Outside, April moved through its business the wind, the new sounds of land coming back to life, a horse shifting in the barn. All the ordinary sounds of a ranch at night that she had been listening to long enough, now that they had become familiar, the auditory texture of a place she knew. She thought about the closet room at Mrs. Halverson's, $11, the burned hotel sign still hanging on its nail. Thought about the trunk she'd finally unpacked and the contract in the top of it. She thought about a woman in Cleveland who had sold the last of what she owned and bought a train ticket and told herself she was going somewhere new when what she had really been doing was leaving somewhere that had already let her go. She thought about Winnie, bringing her things the stone, the ribbon, the drawing and laying them down quietly, the way you lay down small anchors. She thought about the wages column in the ledger, empty for 4 months, with the numbers written in anyway so they wouldn't be forgotten. I know, she said. He looked at her. I've known for a while, she said. I was waiting until the crisis was over to decide what to do with it, because I didn't want to make a decision under pressure that I'd second-guess later. And now the crisis is over, he said. More or less, she said. And she looked at him across the kitchen table, this man who had fixed harnesses under duress and written letters to his brother, and read the mortgage notice with the expression of someone already preparing for the worst. This man who said her name sometimes with a weight it didn't usually carry. This man who was imperfect in the specific ways that meant she understood him, because she had her own version of most of those imperfections and had made a kind of peace with them. I'm not a romantic person, she said. I want to be honest about that from the start. I don't have easy feelings about these things. I never have. And I've been wrong before, badly wrong, and I'm not. She stopped. Started again. I'm not going to be careless with this. I'm not asking you to be careless, he said. I know. She looked at her hands on the table. I'm saying yes, she said, carefully, with both of us understanding that carefully is how I do things, and that won't change. He was quiet for a moment. Carefully is fine, he said, and his voice had the quality of someone who has been holding something tightly for a long time and has just been told they can set it down. Carefully is exactly fine. She nodded. She picked up her pen and looked at the accounts and then put the pen back down because that was clearly not what the moment called for. Coffee's cold, she said. It's been cold for an hour, he said. I'll make more, she said. She got up and made the coffee. He sat at the table and watched her do it. And neither of them said anything more for a while because neither of them needed to, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the April night went about its work. There are things that happen in a life that don't announce themselves while they're happening. You don't know, on the day, you get off a stagecoach with $11 and find a burned building where your future was supposed to be, that you are standing at the beginning of something, rather than the end of it. You don't know. When you walk 4 miles on bad boots to knock on a stranger's door and offer to work for room and board, that the stranger's barn and the stranger's child and the stranger's slow particular way of looking at you will eventually become the geography of your daily life. It doesn't feel like beginning. It feels like desperation, which has its own logic and its own demands and leaves very little room for anything as fragile as hope. But sometimes Desperation walks you somewhere that choice alone wouldn't have taken you. And sometimes the place you end up is not the place you were trying to reach. It's better, or harder, or more real than anything you'd planned for, and the planning would have kept you from it if the plan hadn't fallen through. Mabel Whitmore had not planned to go to Wyoming. She had planned to cook meals in a hotel and have a room with a lock and $8 a month, and a life that was organized and manageable and safely small. She had planned, in other words, the life of a woman who had been disappointed enough times to stop wanting things she wasn't sure she could have. The burned hotel had saved her from that plan. She didn't understand this immediately. She understood it slowly, the way you understand most things that matter, by living through enough of the aftermath to see the shape of what had happened. By mid-spring of 1885, when the east fence was repaired, and the cattle contract was signed, and the repayment schedule to Mrs. Tolliver was proceeding on time, and Vickers had sent a letter from Cheyenne confirming that the federal investigation into Western Territorial holdings had expanded to include partners in 2 additional territories. She had enough distance to see it. The shape of it was not neat. It never is. There was still the debt to Mrs. Tolliver, which would take the better part of 2 years to clear. There was still the work, which was always more than anticipated and less glamorous than it sounded. There was still Caleb's grief for Eleanor, which did not go away, because he had found someone new. Grief doesn't accommodate itself that obligingly, but which had found slowly a place to live alongside the present instead of in front of it. There was still Winnie, who was 9 now and had opinions about everything, and expressed them with a directness that she had perhaps absorbed from proximity to Mabel, and that would likely cause her no end of trouble in her adult life, and was. Also exactly the quality she would need to survive it. None of it was finished. None of it was resolved into something clean and final. Life on the Bar Ranch continued to be the specific, gritty, demanding, occasionally beautiful thing that it had always been. And Mabel continued to be a woman with wide shoulders and rough hands, and a gift for arithmetic and a limited tolerance for people who moved her things. But it was hers, in the way that matters most. It was hers. Mrs. Tolliver arrived in June on a Wednesday, stepping off the southbound stage in Harrow Flats, with a leather traveling case and the expression of a woman accustomed to arriving places and assessing them quickly. She was 61, small, with the kind of energy that made her seem like she was moving, even when she was standing still. Caleb had sent Pruitt to meet her with the wagon. Mabel had stayed at the ranch because there was a meal to prepare, and because she knew Ruth Tolliver well enough to know she'd prefer to be met by the house being ready rather than everyone standing on the road. When the wagon came up the drive, Mabel was in the kitchen doorway. Ruth got down from the wagon with Pruitt's reluctant assistance and looked at the ranch, the house, the repaired fence, the barn, the land running out to the hills, and then she looked at Mabel. "Better than I expected," she said. "Did you expect it to be worse?" Mabel asked. "I expected it to be what you described in your letters," Ruth said, which was accurate. But accurate and good are not always the same thing, and this is both. She came up the path and embraced Mabel with the directness of a woman who did not perform affection, but felt it genuinely. "You look well," she said. "I'm not miserable," Mabel said. Ruth stepped back and looked at her face. "No," she said, "you're not." She looked at Mabel's face for another moment, with the attention of someone reading something. "Good," she said, and went inside. She stayed 4 days. In those 4 days, she sat with Caleb and went over the repayment arrangement and reviewed the current accounts and asked questions with the precision of a woman who had learned to manage money by watching her husband refuse to let her manage it and deciding that was not a permanent condition. She was satisfied with what she found. She told Caleb plainly that she was satisfied, and Caleb told her plainly that he intended to have the debt cleared by fall of the following year, and she told him she would hold him to that, and they shook hands across the front room desk. In the evenings, she sat with Mabel in the kitchen, after Winnie was in bed, and they talked the way people talk when they have known each other long enough to skip the social scaffolding and go straight to the thing itself. They talked about Cleveland and the years before, and the men both of them had married, who had not turned out to be what they presented. They talked about money and what it did to people when they had it and when they didn't. They talked about the winter just past, and Crane, and what Mabel had built here. And Ruth said once, "I always knew you were capable of something. I just didn't know what the situation would be that finally let you be it." The situation was a burned hotel, Mabel said. "The best things usually start with something falling through," Ruth said. On the 3rd evening, after a long silence, Ruth said, "Are you going to marry him?" Mabel looked at her coffee cup. That's a direct question. I'm a direct woman. We haven't discussed it formally, Mabel said. But informally? She was quiet for a moment. There are practical complications, she said. A ranch can't have two managers with equal standing. And if we married, the question of the household manager's contract becomes strange. You're describing a contract problem, Ruth said, when I asked about a marriage. I'm describing a real concern, Mabel said. Spent 4 months here without wages. I don't intend to put myself back in a position where my contribution is invisible because it's assumed. Ruth looked at her steadily. Then make sure it's not assumed, she said. That's a negotiation, not an obstacle. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, Ruth said. But it's not complicated the way you're making it either. Frightened. That's what's complicated. Mabel looked at her. Ruth had always had this quality, the ability to name the thing underneath the stated thing without malice. The way you name a fact about weather. Yes, Mabel said. I'm frightened. Of course you are, Ruth said. You've built something real here, and you don't want to lose the shape of it by changing it. She picked up her cup. But things change shape whether you want them to or not. Question is whether you're the one deciding the new shape. Mabel said nothing. He's a good man, Ruth said. I've been watching him for 4 days. He's not easy, but good men rarely are. And he looks at you the way people look at things they don't take for granted. I know, Mabel said quietly. Then you know what to do, Ruth said. You've always known what to do. That's one of the things about you that has never changed, even when everything else was falling apart. She finished her coffee and went to bed, and Mabel sat alone in the kitchen that was hers and thought about what it meant to decide the shape of things, and whether she was brave enough, and understood in the end that the answer was yes, not because she was fearless. She was not, but because she had walked 4 miles in bad boots to knock on a stranger's door, and that had required the same quality she was going to need now, the quality of moving toward something uncertain, because standing still wasn't the answer. She talked to Caleb on the evening after Ruth left. They were at the table, as they often were in the evenings, the kitchen, the natural center of the house, the place where everything real happened. And she told him what she'd been thinking, and what she needed, and what she was afraid of. Approximately that order, because honesty in a sequence was more useful than honesty all at once. He listened. He did not rush to answer. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The contract stays." She looked at him. However we do this, he said, the contract stays. Your position is your position. It doesn't disappear because the arrangement between us changes. Those are 2 different things, and I want them to be 2 different things. She had not expected him to lead with this. She had expected she wasn't sure what she had expected. Something more personal, perhaps. Something that addressed the emotional rather than the structural. You thought about this, she said. Since February, he said. Since you told me what you needed to be clear. I've been thinking about how to make it clear. He looked at her. I'm not interested in a situation where you disappear into this place, where what you are becomes invisible because it's assumed. I watched that happen to Eleanor in the last 2 years before she died, and it wasn't right. And I didn't know how to name it at the time, and now I can name it, and I don't want it. She sat with this for a moment. You're a better thinker than you let on, she said. I have good material to work with, he said. She looked at him across the table, this particular man, with his particular silences and his ghost of a smile and his way of meaning things. He sometimes took too long to say, and she thought about the stone in the trunk and the ribbon and the drawing, all the small things Winnie had given her. And she thought about empty wages, columns and letters written at midnight, and $312 and a burned hotel sign on a single nail. All right, she said. All right, he said. All right, she said again. And it meant what it meant, and they both knew it. They were married in September, at the county clerk's office in Harrow Flats, with Aldridge as witness and Winnie standing beside Mabel in a dress that Mabel had made from material she'd ordered in June. The dress was dark blue wool, practical, nothing elaborate. Winnie wore it with the seriousness. She wore everything. Except that at the moment the clerk finished the brief official words, she reached over and took Mabel's hand with both of hers. The way you take hold of something you've been hoping for and aren't certain yet is real. Dearborn had polished his boots for the occasion. Mabel noticed this and said nothing about it. Some things were acknowledged better by noticing than by speaking. Gus shook Caleb's hand outside afterward and said 4 words. About time, he said. Both of you. Pruitt left an extra cup of coffee on the windowsill in the morning. What happened to Harlan Crane was not dramatic. Federal investigations rarely produce dramatic outcomes. They produced documents and findings and consequences that arrived slowly and through official channels, which is less satisfying but more real. Western Territorial Holdings Group was dissolved by court order in December of 1885. 3 men connected to the company, including a silent partner who turned out to be a territorial banking official, faced criminal fraud charges that were resolved over the following 2 years through a combination of guilty pleas and civil settlements. Crane himself was found to have been a knowing participant in the land acquisition scheme and was assessed financial penalties and permanently barred from holding any position in banking or financial services in the territory. He did not go to prison. Mabel thought about this once and then set it aside, because what mattered was not what happened to Crane, but what had not happened to the Bar R, and the Bar R was still standing, which was the only verdict that required her continued attention. The Mercer family recovered their legal fees. Burley handled the civil action and won, which he sent a letter about that. Mabel read twice and then filed in the account book. The debt to Mrs. Tolliver was cleared in August of 1886, 2 months ahead of Caleb's stated schedule. Mabel sent the final payment with a letter, and Ruth wrote back saying she hoped the investment had been sound, and that she expected to come through Wyoming again the following spring. Came and stayed a week, and sat in the kitchen in the evenings. And this time, the conversation was different. Not the conversation of 2 women who had survived something, but the conversation of 2 women who had built something, which is a different register entirely. Winnie was 10 when the debt was paid. She had been promoted in the schoolhouse to the advanced reading group, which her teacher mentioned to Mabel in a note that used the phrase remarkable comprehension for her age. Mabel put the note in the top of the trunk. She had transferred the stone and the ribbon and the drawing thereto when she properly moved her things from the small room to the room she shared with Caleb, not because the small room had been bad, but because the things belonged to the version of her that had arrived here, and she wanted to keep that version somewhere she could find it, so she wouldn't forget what it had cost to become the version she was now. She didn't write this down anywhere. She just knew it. There is something particular about a woman who has been underestimated for most of her life. Not a simple thing, not a clean story of triumph, but something complicated and specific that people who haven't lived it often miss. The underestimating doesn't go away when you prove it wrong. It doesn't disappear in a moment of recognition. People who have decided you are limited will often look for evidence to confirm it, long after you have given them evidence to the contrary, because their picture of you is more comfortable than the reality. And comfort is a powerful thing. What changes is not them. What changes is the weight you give to it. Mabel Whitmore Mabel Rusk, after September of 1885, though she used both names professionally and the distinction mattered to her, had spent the better part of her adult life carrying the weight of other people's assessments of her. She knew the weight. She knew exactly what it felt like, which was not like a stone tied to her ankle, but more like a kind of atmospheric pressure, constant and invisible, that made every movement slightly harder than it should have been. Dorothea Crane's look in the kitchen, Featherstone's 20 minutes of condescension, before he realized she knew the accounts. Dearborn's cup moved back to the wrong place. The woman with the notebook who had come to assess her kitchen as a future property and had not thought to introduce herself because she had not considered Mabel to be someone worth introducing herself to. All of that. The accumulated, ordinary, grinding weight of it. She set it down in increments. Not all at once. That's not how it works for anyone, and anyone who tells you it happened all at once is leaving out the parts that were hard. She set it down in the process of doing the work that needed doing, not because doing the work made her less conscious of the weight, but because work was more interesting than weight, and she had always found it easier to move towards something than to stand still being resentful of something. She set it down by earning the respect of men who had withheld it on principle and learning to value that earning without needing to make it mean more than it did. She set it down by signing a contract with her own name on it in her own handwriting and putting it in a trunk where she could find it. She set it down by learning, slowly and imperfectly, that the place where a person ends up is not always the place they were trying to get to, and that this is not the same as failure. The Bar Ranch in the spring of 1887 was not a transformed place. It was a working ranch on marginal Wyoming land with ongoing fence problems and a drainage situation in the back pasture that Mabel had been planning to address for 2 seasons and hadn't quite gotten to yet. Cattle contract was good. The accounts were clean. The operational costs were lower than they'd been in 1000. 884, and the output was higher, which was the result of 2 years of careful, unglamorous management rather than any single dramatic improvement. Winnie was 11 and had opinions about everything, including how the kitchen should be organized, which she expressed without hesitation and which Mabel took seriously without always agreeing with, and they argued about it sometimes with the cheerful directness of two people who fundamentally respect each other, and the cups stayed where Mabel put them, and eventually Winnie accepted this. Caleb was himself. He was the man who fixed harnesses under duress and said important things only when he was completely sure of them, and had a ghost of a smile that had become, in 2 years, more substantial than it had been in October of 1884, though it retained something of the ghost quality that she suspected was simply his nature and had decided she liked. She did not think about what she'd had before the years in Cleveland, the marriage that had left her, the accumulated small humiliations of being a woman with no money and no connections, and an appearance that made strangers look away. Not that she had forgotten. She hadn't forgotten. Carried it the same way she carried the things in the top of her trunk, accessible, real, part of the inventory of a life that had cost something and produced something, which was all any life could honestly claim. On an evening in April of 1887, she sat at the kitchen table with the accounts and the lamp, and the sound of the ranch settling into its nighttime quiet, and she thought, briefly and without making too much of it, about the woman who had stood in front of a burned hotel with $11 and no plan, and had looked down the road and chosen to walk further into the unknown rather than back toward the merely familiar. She was glad of that woman. She was glad of the boots and the blister, and the 4 miles and the knock on the door. She was glad of all of it, not in the comfortable way of someone who has come through something easy, but in the harder, truer way of someone who has come through something real and arrived somewhere that required exactly the person the hard thing had made her. Closed the account book and turned down the lamp and went to bed. And the Bar Ranch sat in the dark Wyoming spring, under whatever stars the clouds that night allowed, still standing, still working, still the place where a woman nobody had expected to survive had made herself, one careful unglamorous day at a time, entirely at home.